Hello there, lovely folks of YouTube, Ren here. I wanted to talk about this rather inconspicuous little plant here next to me. This plant goes by the name Heirochloe odorata, more commonly known as sweetgrass. This is a plant that, although it's most commonly associated with native practices here in the Americas, it actually grows in North America, Northern Europe, and even some parts of Northern Asia. It is considered to be circumboreal, meaning it has a band that grows around the entirety of the Arctic Circle. So it's not just a Native American plant, interestingly enough. This is a perennial grass. Grows usually to about between 2 and 3 feet tall. The more you fertilize it, or the better the soil is, of course, the taller it's going to get. Sorry, my notes are really, the wind took them. Okay. But anyway, yes, it can grow to 3 or more feet, but more commonly will be in about the 2-foot range. That's about how tall mine gets. This is an interesting plant because it shows that it has a lot of history of human cultivation. It generally does not grow well from seed. The seeds generally are not typically viable. You might, like 1 out of 1,000, I think, is the normal germination rate on these seeds. So this is not a plant that I would recommend buying seed for. If you don't have this plant and you don't know anyone who has this plant, the best way to obtain this plant is actually to buy plugs, or just little, basically baby plants of the actual plant itself. Not buying the seed, because chances are you won't get it to germinate successfully. And of course, the fact that that seed is not viable shows that probably humans have had an imprint in shaping the cultivation of this plant. Now, this is a plant that natively, and I say natively very loosely because most of the native growth that we have, particularly here in the Americas, was probably originally a cultivation site from one of the native tribes. So we can't really say for sure whether it's actually growing wild or not. It probably was actually cultivated, and just the people who were originally cultivating it have been lost for various genocide and other reasons. But yes, when you find it, when you happen across it, most commonly the places that it grows best would be on places like floodplains, riverbanks, things like that. So places where it gets frequent waterings, but still has fairly well-draining soil. So what we need to have basically to successfully grow this plant is well-draining soil, but also frequently water it. Now mine is actually looking a little dry. I probably need to water mine more, but I'm bad at that. What can I say? If it rains, then I figure that's good enough, and it generally isn't. But it's doing well regardless of my neglect. So, because this is a pretty hardy plant, it is a grass. And just like all other grasses, it will just kind of do its own thing if you give it the right conditions. So, now I normally have clay soil here. I did amend this area with some compost to kind of lighten up that soil, because the clay soil will hang on to moisture a little bit too long, and it's not as enthusiastic about that. The main thing you need to do to tend this plant, like a lot of other grasses, doesn't compete very well against weeds. In particular, other grasses will outcompete this plant. So regular good weeding practices are really essential to getting this plant to have a good foothold. So usually, 2-3 times a year, I'll come through and just very carefully weed all of the area that my sweetgrass is growing in. Now this patch, you can see it actually extends over here, it's all the way back through here. It started with one tiny little plug. Let me see, I don't think I have my tag anymore. One tiny little plug that started right here. And in 2 years, it's spread to encompass this whole area. So if you give it the right conditions, it will happily spread. So I'm gonna cut to give you a close-up to look more closely at this plant, so we can talk about some of the distinctive characteristics that help you differentiate this grass from other grasses in the area. So let's look at that. All right. So here we are looking at it close up. this is probably the most distinctive characteristic right here, and it is this seed head. So sweetgrass is really the only grass that really makes this kind of seed head with the very sort of loose, yeah, I don't know the botanical names for these sorts of things, but like the seeds themselves are hung very loosely kind of on, you know, the little stems here. So that's very distinctive of sweetgrass. So like, for example, I have some other grasses here. This is a weedy grass that I need to pull out, and you can see the seed head is distinctively different from the sweetgrass. So if you happen to see these sort of seed heads, then you know that's the sweetgrass right there. Another distinctive characteristic that you can see really well here in the sunlight is how shiny these leaves are. Like, you can actually see they almost get kind of like a silvery look with the light reflecting off of them. That's a very distinctive sweetgrass characteristic as well, that real sort of silvery shine to it. Sometimes if the light hits it just right and the wind is blowing, it looks like just waves of silver going through here. It's really gorgeous. That again is a very distinctive sweetgrass thing, because if you look at some of these other grasses here, they're more dull. Sweetgrass has a very smooth leaf, so part of that shininess is actually because there are no hairs on the leaf. So that's another characteristic that helps to differentiate it from other grasses, particularly crabgrasses, because crabgrasses tend to have these really fine hairs on the leaf, whereas sweetgrass does not. So now, of course, the biggest characteristic and the most distinctive characteristic that really differentiates sweetgrass from other grasses is the fragrance. Sweetgrass does contain coumarin. Is that weedy grass in there? That might be. No. Okay. It does contain coumarin, which gives it a sort of vanilla hay fragrance. That's very distinctive. The fragrance is a little bit stronger when the grass has been dried, but it is still present in the fresh grass. And of course, you can always just kind of like take one of the leaves and kind of crush and rub it to try and release some of that fragrance. Coumarin is interesting. This is the same compound that's in sweet woodruff that gives sweet woodruff its characteristic fragrance. Now, the use of plants that contain coumarin is restricted here in the United States, because coumarin in the body can actually be conjugated into a related compound called coumadin, which, if you have any kind of medical background, might recognize as a blood thinner. So, because of that, its use is fairly strongly restricted here in the United States. There are lighter restrictions in Europe that allows the use of sweetgrass and other related plants, such as sweet woodruff, to be used in alcoholic beverages primarily, which is why you'll find that there is a Polish vodka that I don't know the name offhand, and even if I saw it spelled out, I probably wouldn't be able to pronounce it properly because Polish is hard, but but it uses the sweetgrass in it, although in Poland they call it bison grass. So it's actually a vodka that is flavored with this grass to give it that sort of, like, you know, vanilla hay sort of fragrance to it. So the fragrance, of course, is not only how we primarily identify sweetgrass, but it's also the main reason that it was grown. It's used in basket making. Native Americans would use it pretty widely for basket making because it has that lovely fragrance to it. And then, of course, it was used for sacred rites in and of itself. So let's segue back into talking about some of the uses of this plant, because the historical uses also tie into the magical uses. So as I mentioned, here in Native American practices, they use this primarily for both basket weaving and for sacred uses. The most common way that most of us are accustomed to seeing this plant, of course, is in a braid. The braid, of course, is it's a very sort of moving, sacred thing to make the braid in and of itself. Robin Wall Kimmerer, if you have not read her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, I highly recommend it. The book is actually named after the practice, and a lot of the natives consider it to be braiding the hair of the Earth Mother, and it's sort of it's a very moving ritual that sort of like brings you in contact with the earth in sort of like a sisterhood, or, you know, sort of like the way a child would braid her mother's hair. It's really cool thing to be doing. And then of course the braids themselves could either be kept to sort of, bring protection to the bearer or to the home in which it resides. Some people will put them in their cars. A longer braid can be made, just sort of stacking multiple sheaths together and braiding it into a long braid can actually be used to braid it into a belt that can be worn around a person as well. But a lot of the time the braids are also burned. You can either put it onto a fire or braid it, or just burn it from one end like you would a smoke wand. I actually have mine wrapped with string so that I can burn it part way and then kind of tie off the end again so I don't have to burn the whole thing all at once. I have not yet found a reason to burn it, something that I felt called for it yet, but I have it just in case I need it. The braid, of course, oh my gosh, has that absolutely delicious sort of, it's like, how do I even describe it? It's like vanilla and honey and hay, and just like, it smells like summer sunshine. It's delicious, delicious. Now in Europe, of course, they also saw this plant as having sort of sacred connotations. In fact, that's where the genus name actually comes from. Heirochloe actually means sacred grass. In Europe, it was primarily used as a strewing grass. Particularly, it would be strewn on the floors and on the steps of churches during particular saints' holy days, to sort of designate, the additional sacredness of those days. So there are, and I just think it's really interesting that both, the Native American and the European traditions have both designated, a sort of sacredness to this grass that is really fascinating to me. So, now of course, because the primary uses of this grass were mostly here in North America, like I said, there are some uses in the Europe, but it wasn't quite as culturally important as it was to the Native Americans here. Because of that, we don't have a lot of European magical correspondences for this plant. So it wasn't really a plant that was mentioned in a lot of the old European herbals or, in the grimoires that were written by European practitioners. So we'd have to sort of look at this plant and sort of, kind of feel our way into these correspondences. We don't have a lot of historical basis for them. Now, obviously, there's a lot of attachment with earth magic. Anytime you have a grass, I would consider it to be an earth-based plant, just because of the way it grows. It's very, very deeply connected with the earth. And a lot of the other plants that, are grasses are also considered to be earth plants, because those are the plants that are things like cereal grains, wheat, corn, barley, things of that, oats, rye, all those sorts of plants are considered generally to have sort of earth energy to them. And I would consider sweetgrass to be in that same sort of family of having the very, sort of grounding and stabilizing earth energy. Now, of course, because of the way that it grows on riverbanks, you could see a little bit of water influence in this plant as well. Just as a possibility, something to think about. As far as planetary associations, that's another one that's hard to say. I would probably put this under Venus, just because it has, I don't know, that sort of sweet fragrance to me is a Venus attribute. Cereal grains, of course, typically also fall under Venus as well because of the fertility aspects. And just sort of, the ability that sweetgrass has, where it's sort of like bringing a balancing or harmonizing energy and sort of uplifting the energy of a place, that seems to me more of a Venusian sort of influence. But, again, this is all sort of UPG theorizing on my part. There's nothing really, there's not a lot of really, hefty consensus on how the planetary aspects of this plant might play out. So feel free to play around with your own thoughts on that one as well. So, but obviously, of course, the primary uses of this plant are basically sort of protection and sort of raising the energetic vibrations of a place, sort of, you know, just bringing that calm, happiness, peace sort of energy to a place. And that's primarily what I would use this plant for, and what I do use this plant for. So it's a delicious plant. It smells amazing. Great additive to incense blends. And of course, you can braid it. I will make the caveat that if you want to make your own braids, or if you purchase a braid from somewhere, look for a braid that's actually cut and not pulled, because pulling the grass actually decreases its ability to recuperate and regrow in that area. So anyone who is harvesting this plant by pulling it out of the ground instead of cutting it at the ground is actually harming the plant and its ability to regrow. So I don't recommend either, you know, patronizing people who do that or doing it yourself. My braids have all been cut pretty close to ground level, and then just braided from there. Yes, so just watch out for that. Make sure that you're not supporting anyone who engages in that practice, because it is harmful to the plant. And this plant is one that really needs a helping hand from humanity because of that long history of cultivation. It really does, it has grown to become reliant upon us. I think it was Robin Wall Kimmerer who said something along the lines of sweetgrass thrives in places where it is harvested. So proper harvesting will cause the sweetgrass to thrive, but improper care will eventually decrease and eventually just remove its existence in that area. So this is a plant that you know, has come to rely on our partnership and stewardship, and we need to be respectful of that relationship and treat it properly. So anyway, that's all I have for you on this lovely plant. I hope this video finds you well, and I will see you again soon.